Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Wednesday, December 16th, 2020. And I just want to take a moment and pause and say this week marks the 13th year. December 18th was our first day in 2007. This is the 13th year of our doing these broadcasts. And we've, of course, switched over to the podcast app for the past few years, but some time to kind of reflect and celebrate for what we've been doing for these past 13 years. It also happens to be my daughter's 13th birthday. So that's why I remember the date so clearly. So tonight's broadcast, if you don't know, is a question and answer. Any question you have about mental health, about children, about a child that might be at Evoke, we're happy to take those questions. I'll do my best to answer them. You can submit questions at any time during the broadcast, and Malia will be collecting those questions and passing those on to me when there's a space in the broadcast. You can always send questions, suggestions, any ideas to webinar@evoketherapy.com. You can send that throughout the week, and we're happy to put those in the front of the line when we have these question and answer broadcasts. So, without any further ado, let's get right into what happens with our question and answer. The first question is, what is a typical day at Evoke like? Some of you might not know what wilderness therapy is. Wilderness therapy is our version of it is primitive living nomadic wilderness therapy, which means that it's really camping outdoors. We use traditional therapeutic models, but we're doing it set in the outdoors. It invites a kind of mindfulness. In fact, even NASA and Harvard University have talked about and published in the last couple of years reports where they use astronauts. Astronauts use wilderness therapy like ours to build trust and a team if they haven't worked together, because this kind of wilderness therapy, this kind of primitive living, invites a kind of vulnerability, and you have to communicate, you have to problem solve, and stress is naturally introduced to the environment. So that's what we do at Evoke. We are a wilderness therapy program for adolescents and young adults. A typical day is going to include things that will sound like just a normal day. You're going to have your breakfast time, your cleanup time. We try to move camp 5 days a week. You're going to have time for studying some of the academics. Each day there'll be time to work on what we call hard skills. One of the main hard skills in our program is making a fire by rubbing sticks together. We use a bow drill fire method. There'll be group therapy sessions, oftentimes 1 or 2 formal sessions per day, but we have a culture where a standing group can happen throughout the day. So you're probably going to see a few to 10 standing groups throughout the day. And this is just a time to pause the activities for the day and to circle up and have a discussion. It could be somebody checking in about a feeling that they're having. It could be problem solving. It could be making requests. It could be giving feedback. And then the therapist is going to give therapeutic assignments the kids, the clients, the students, the young adults are going to be working on throughout the week. Letters come in twice a week. So those are excuse me, once a week. Those are big days when they're reading letters and writing back home. When the therapist is there for the 2 days, the therapist is there per week. We get a resupply of food. We get a resupply of laundry. That happens twice a week. And they're kind of resetting themselves camping wise for the week. So it's like living outside. It's just living outside in the context of that natural small group experience. You really get to introduce, or I should say, nature introduces all of the challenges, the lessons, the dilemmas that you have to work on. The weather is a factor. Winter can be challenging, of course. I've always said that I think we're often a more provocative, more impactful program in the winter. It's easier, at least, to be a wilderness therapist in the winter because you have to be mindful. You have to be thoughtful. You have to work hard and plan ahead. You have to rely on the group, and you have to rely on the staff. So those are the kinds of things that happen throughout the day. It's camping with some academics, some activities, and therapy throughout the day. And everything becomes grist for the mill. So anything that happens, a difficult letter from home, a rainstorm, everything becomes the topic in therapy, or the backdrop in therapy. So yeah, that's what a typical day looks like. It looks like camping, moving, hiking. We try to hike 5 days out of the week, out of the 7 days, and have two layover days where resupply and therapy is getting done. But therapy is happening all the time, and some of the most impactful, important moments happen between the therapist visits. So hope that gives you a little glimpse into what we do in the wilderness therapy program. Somebody writes, I have a brother who recently opened a restaurant and told me it was following 100% COVID protocol. When I went in there, I noticed he was not following protocol, and a lot of people working there were not also. He takes his children over to my parents' house and to be babysat, and so I began to worry about the risk. I told him I felt like I was lied to, and I was upset and worried about my parents' health. He was hurt and upset, and I felt compromised our relationship by calling him a liar. I felt I had compromised our relationship by calling him a liar. How could I have expressed my feelings of trust, of our trust being broken in a way that was not an attack, but would also let him know that I had felt lied to and betrayed? What a fantastic question that allows me to address lots of complex issues. So thank you for that. And it's not necessarily about a child, and I think in that way, you can kind of learn the principles in a different way. Let me say this first and foremost. I'm going to go through several principles. Number one, it's a mantra that I repeat in my head every day, several times a day. In fact, I've said this out loud a couple of times today already. There's an idea in relationships and mental health that I've learned from my own therapy, which is in many examples, you don't get to win. You get to choose how to lose. And when we accept that idea that you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose. In lots of circumstances and lots of relationships, it frees you up to just be your authentic self and to speak your truth. That's first and foremost. The second principle I think that would be most important to touch on, and this goes for all of you, especially with your children. In fact, I posted something today on my Instagram, a quote from the Journey of the Heroic Parent today about this. An aspect, an attribute, a characteristic that's really important in relationships, especially when there's conflict or somebody does something that might upset you or might seem strange or hurt you or anger you, is if we can foster at first, at least, a sense of curiosity. I have been told this as a client for years, and the longer I do this and really the more capacity I develop, the easier it is for me to be curious. So what I would say to you is you could approach him with and try to get yourself into the headspace of being curious and asking questions. You know, there's a third idea. So first, I've talked about curiosity. I've talked about developing and fostering curiosity and asking questions. But another idea is resistance or defensiveness. Resistance is what we would call it in therapy, or defensiveness is what we will call it in everyday relationships. Is basically your nervous system being on guard because there's a threat. So even if you ask the question in the right way, or simply and gently expressed it in an assertive but kind way, you still could have triggered your brother's nervous system to see it as a threat. He could still hear that he's doing something wrong. That doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. I want to be really clear about that. But he can still hear it that way because he's wired to be on defense, on the lookout for being told that he's wrong or bad or that he's done something wrong. So you may not have done anything wrong. You may have done it completely right. And if we go back to the idea that you don't get to win, you get to choose how to lose, then the way you're choosing to lose is I'm going to share my feelings, ask some questions, gently and kindly tell you what I want, and see if we can get somewhere. But I might lose. So that principle is always at play. But I think the important thing is when I think about resistance and defense, I was taught this in my training that if you think about resistance, like you're driving a car on a frozen lake. The analogy is that if you can imagine a frozen lake, a solid frozen lake, no water underneath, a solid frozen lake, that when you're driving your car on a sheet of ice, you can't accelerate too quickly. You can't brake too abruptly. You can't turn one way or the other too quickly or sharply, or you'll lose traction. So when I train therapists, I talk about this frozen lake and a car example and say it's a skill set to kind of learn how much gas, how much brake to apply, and to notice when you lose traction. In the case of your brother, if you had done everything right and he started becoming defensive, you could have pulled back, right? One of the things that I teach our therapists and our staff is when you see somebody's defense or somebody's nervous system become up and up regulated, right? On guard, in fight or flight mode, you can take a step back. In therapy, I teach this principle, and it's very important and hard to learn. I say it's not usually the first mistake that is the great mistake in therapy. You can definitely make mistakes in therapy with what you say, what you do. It can trigger somebody's fight or flight, feeling of threatened mode, but it's holding on to it and not letting go. I talk about holding it lightly. So think about the frozen lake and the car. Notice his threat. Can you take a step back? Can you then respond with more curiosity and kindness? But in the end of the day, I want to be very clear to all of you. To be your authentic self, even with really, really good skills, to be your authentic self, to stand your ground, to show up in your relationships authentically. And ideally, if you have the capacity, with kindness and gentleness. You're still going to lose sometimes. And ultimately, if you're doing what you can, I don't want to teach here for you specifically or for parents here. I don't want to teach you have to walk on eggshells around people. You know, part of being in a relationship with somebody is that people don't have to do it perfect. But if you just notice the psychology of defendedness, of feeling threatened, of feeling judged, if you can pay attention to that, if you can do it from a place of capacity, you can navigate things a little bit better. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there are going to be times when you set boundaries with your brother, with your partner, with your children, with your therapist, with your friend, with your colleague, on and on and on. There are going to be times when you set clear boundaries and you will lose. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to give up the idea of being right and good. And we have to shift our mind to being us, being who we are. And of course, fostering and developing capacity and skills as we go along. But if you think you can win in every circumstance, you're deceiving yourself. And the person will set you up and tell you why you're failing. But in many ways, they're just taking that bad feeling they feel when they're feeling judged or attacked, criticized, or rejected. They're taking the badness that they feel inside and they're putting it back on you. So from your description, it was a reasonable response or thought or experience. You came to him. Being curious could be one thing that could improve it, but just notice defenses. Notice the nervous system. It's there to protect us from being bit by a rattlesnake or being hit by a bus, right? That's what it's there for. It's there to protect us. But the more trauma we have, the more our nervous system is likely to respond to situations that aren't life-threatening as if they are, right? That's what a trauma response is. You're responding to something in a disproportionate way. But last thing I'll say before I move on, and your question has given me an opportunity to talk about so many things tonight. The last thing that I'll say is that part of our healing is to develop a kind of flexibility. As we heal, we'll be able to be more flexible in our response. to threats. There's a saying in Al-Anon. There's a saying in Al-Anon that says, if it's hysterical, it's historical. And what that means is that there's some unprocessed, unhealed trauma, oftentimes a pattern of behavior in the past, that this specific moment in time is triggering. If you find yourself responding disproportionately, or people are saying to you, you're overreacting, what if we all, because we understood trauma, what if we all realized in that moment, I wonder what's being triggered for you or for me? I wonder what this reminds me of. What this is an echo of in my life. And the more we realize that our non-calm, non-creative, non-flexible responses, our disproportionate responses, it would be unkind to say that you're overreacting. It would be unkind to say that you're having an inappropriate reaction, but rather you're responding to something else. What is it? So if somebody in your life seems to be reacting disproportionately, instead of saying you're overreacting or you're being too sensitive, which is just gaslighting them, right? Dismissing their feelings, you say, tell me what's going on for you. I noticed the reaction and I want to learn about it. And it takes time and practice. That's what therapy really does for us. It gives us the ability to kind of process these things, and even to have a catalog in the back of our brain and say, I know one of my triggers is when I don't feel seen, I get angry, I get upset, I get reactive. This is the work in therapy. Therapy is using a guide to travel and make sense out of our inner landscape. And as we do that, we understand where the valleys and the cracks, right? Where the blocks are, where the pokey bushes are in our landscape. And then we heal it. We heal it by processing it. So thanks for that wonderful question. Someone wrote, our daughter just completed her second week at Evoke. What is your recommendation for keeping in touch with her now? Letters, cards, photos? How often may we send a message? We've only submitted our hopes and intentions letters this far, typically when our phone calls allowed and arranged after a certain period of time or because of progress made by our daughter. For those of you who are parents with children in the program, there are some, on your parent portal, there's a list of old broadcasts, right? Archived broadcasts that I've done that kind of go through letter writing, that go through kind of the early stages, middle stages, and end stages of the program, what it feels like when we start. So I'll refer you to that because you can go back to that. You can also browse our library on YouTube, in your parent portal, or on any of your podcasts app. Right? Go to your podcast app, find our podcast station called Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, and just scroll down them. But I'll give you some of the answers right here and now. They get letters once a week. So part of the weekly phone call with your child's therapist is to kind of learn, is there a theme? Is there an assignment this week? You don't need to write several times in between because the letters are only going to be delivered one day per week. And sometimes therapists have a theme. One principle that I talk about in the letter writing broadcast that you can find on any of the platforms I just described is learn to write bad letters. And what I mean by learning to write bad letters is you don't have to get it perfect. We're not asking you to pull a rabbit out of a hat. We're not asking you to tiptoe and walk on eggshells. We're asking you to just tell the truth about where you're at right now. Like I said, consult with your child's therapist, but you can also just write what comes to mind. It's a combination of the weekly report that you're getting, the letters you get from your child, and then what's going on in your own life, including some of the work that you're all doing. I would have every parent normalize apologizing to their child and acknowledging that they're learning and growing in or out of Evoke. And sometimes when a parent has a reaction to a letter or something a child does, what I encourage the parent to do is to say something like, my first reaction was X. At first, I wanted to lecture you or tell you how you were scaring me. But what I'm learning is that's my issue. That's my feeling, and I'm responsible for that. So I need to go to a meeting or meditate or pray or read a book or listen to a podcast. So you're being honest and authentic with your kind of knee-jerk response. You're telling the truth. And on top of that, you're also sharing with them that you're learning and growing and evolving, which is what we're asking them to do. I had this thought last night. I'm going to insert this here, even though it's not directly an answer to your question. But it came to me last night vividly in the role of myself as a father. So much of the denting and the bruising that we do with our children, so many of the dents and the bruises that we leave with our children are really in the service of us being uncomfortable with our children feeling things, feeling pain or distress, specifically about us and our parenting or about our family or about decisions that we've made. And so while we don't tell our children not to feel, the way we act absolutely suggests not to feel. And then they end up with symptoms or patterns of behaviors, like the children that come to our program. And then we have parent education like you're experiencing right this moment. There are assignments and letters that are assigned to your child to write where they talk about where they're hurt and angry and upset. In other words, we send them to programs like Evoke for substance abuse or self-harm. And the assignments are directed, the assignments directed to them are really just there to facilitate them feeling. And oftentimes we either we start with you or we include you relatively early and say, tell us why you're mad at your parents. Tell us how they've hurt you. And what we're trying to create is an opportunity for them to express feelings that have otherwise been uncomfortable and discouraged and give you practice at listening to it. It is incredibly universal that parents have a hard time sitting with their children's distress. And so they're trying to make their children feel something else or something better, really to take care of the parents' distress. It's really self-serving. We think it's empathic. We think it's for the child, but it's really for us. Because feelings, hard, difficult feelings aren't broken. To grow, to integrate, to evolve, we need to learn to feel our feelings and kind of work our way through them. You know, that's really what therapy is. So thank you for your question. I know I added a bit there. Someone writes, does Evoke assist in the selection of a therapeutic boarding school or the next step for the identified patient? Absolutely, they can. We encourage you to consider strongly hiring an educational consultant. And we work in tandem with them because they specialize in placements. And we will help you the best that we can in that marriage with them. Or if you have at the end decided not to, we will absolutely, that's part of our job for sure. Absolutely. All right, somebody writes this. My 16-year-old son's at Evoke. Anxiety, drugs, school refusal. Now home on a break before going back to mainstream boarding school. He's biracial. Alcoholic dad died when he was 9 after a bitter divorce. Racial identity never discussed. I was the worst codependent. Everything you described plus. Working hard on self, intensives, etc. Both of us 1,000% better. Today, I overheard him on the phone with 2 friends talking about getting a gun, using knives to either rob or scare someone. Talked about dead bodies, jail, etc. My son intimated he's dealing. I told him I heard and asked him to talk to me. 40 minutes of accusing me of being untrustworthy, only caring about myself. daring me to call the police, past threats I made, demand to become emancipated. I used every skill, listening, taking blame, explaining my job as a parent when it comes to his safety and other safety. Eventually went back in my room after packing bag of clothes to leave. I'm terrified. Thoughts about what to do next. I need strategies. There is no other family. But that's a pretty difficult problem to solve. But I'll go back to folks, I hope this makes sense. I really do hope this makes sense. I hope you can see the similarities between this question and the question with the brother and the COVID restaurant. Very, very different in their details. Both involve potential life and death situations, but this one, of course, is much more vividly frightful on its surface, for sure. The guns, the drugs, the dealing, and so forth. At the end of the day, a couple of things I note about your question. Number one, I go back to the same thing I said to the person asking about the brother in the COVID restaurant. You cannot win. You can only choose how to lose. And in the work that we do at Evoke, when I write and I talk and I teach, I talk about this idea that you don't get to be right or good anymore. You get to be you, which is so much better. The one thing you said in your question that gives me an idea of kind of a stumble of yours is when you're explaining him your responsibility about being a parent and your obligation for safety for him and others. That's you trying to be right and good, right? You're hoping if you can explain to him the expectation to be a good parent and citizen in a very reasonable way, by the way, I don't disagree with you. There's a hope that if he understands that explanation, then he'll de-escalate. But obviously he didn't, because he can feel you trying to be right. I go back to the COVID restaurant answer, which is, can you be curious? Can you ask him how he's doing? But at the end of the day, especially when I am given questions that are really potentially dangerous, like this one, the circumstances are dangerous, like this one, you can't win. If you decide to call the police, I wouldn't blame you. And anyone who does, tell them to talk to their therapist about it, because they don't know your truth. I would invite the same principles as the answer to the other question. Curiosity, noticing the nervous system and defensiveness, trying to be your authentic self and realizing you might not get what you want, but you get to set boundaries. A couple of times I've had to, in outpatient therapy early in my career, I've had to call the police on my clients because of a threat to self or others. I've had to do that. It's my legal obligation to do that. My licensing requires me to do that. When there's a specific threat towards somebody else, I have a duty to warn. And if there's a threat toward themselves, I have a duty to report that. The client is not happy with me. The client feels betrayed. The law and the licensing says, specifically for therapists, you may not consider the impact on the relationship when these obligations are at play. You may not, in other words, the law and the licensing says you're not allowed to worry about the fracture in the relationship if it gets to be that severe and that serious. Yours sounds like it could be. Now, I'm not saying for the rest of you that everything is life and death and that everything involves calling the police. That's going to be an extraordinarily rare exception to the rule. The person who asked the question about COVID, there's no police that you can call on that. I guess you can call the authorities if they're violating some of the local rules at the time with COVID. I guess you could do that. But Typically, we're not talking about that level of escalation. But ultimately, you might be in an unwinnable situation. And you might just have to do what you feel best about. And the thing about it is the other person in these relationships, they are really, really good at making sure you understand that you're doing the wrong thing and that you're losing. And to be a self, to be a person, to be authentic, you have to surrender the idea of being a good person in favor of being you. And I'm sorry that you're going through that. That sounds upsetting. I wish there was a path to talk about it where you could hear what these behaviors are trying to they're speaking some kind of trauma or fear or terror. There's something underneath it. I wish there was a pathway to get access to that. And if you think that there is, try to go there. But at the end of the day, there may not be. Somebody says, wondering about treatment for bipolar young adults over 18. Well, that's a broad question. I mean, medication for bipolar disorder is indicated. Of all the disorders that are out there mental health wise, bipolar is probably the one that first and foremost, medication is going to be helpful, if not necessary. And for bipolars during a manic phase, a phase where they feel grandiosity, that's part of the bipolar swing, they want to go off their medication because bipolar medication kind of numbs that high. It's like a drug high. But medication psychiatry is indicated. And then if outpatient therapy works, we do therapy with bipolars, folks struggling with bipolar over 18. And there are other programs. I can't, in one of the slides that we have here, I can't speak to a lot of specific programs generically. Can't make recommendations, of course, over a podcast, but yeah, talk to your wilderness therapist or talk to your educational consultant. They might be able to go over the case with you. Someone writes, "Hi, I just finished The Audacity to Be You on the path of forgiveness. Can you speak of forgiving but still keeping the person or people, in this case siblings, out of one's life? I always feel that somehow unconditional love, therefore freedom, isn't complete without it. Thanks, Brad." Sometimes in order to forgive, you have to create distance. I mean, we use an idea from logical argument to illustrate the point, which is, I believe it's pronounced argumenta. Maybe there's an attorneys or a poli-sci or a logic major here, but I think it's argumentum ad absurdity. I think that's what it is, which means take the argument to the absurd end. If somebody is beating you, and I don't think they're probably beating you, but if somebody is beating you, not only is it extraordinarily difficult to forgive that person, but I would say it's impossible for most human beings to forgive abuse when it's still happening. So distance is okay. There is a toxic idea in dysfunctional families that says we owe loyalty to our family above and beyond our own personal safety and self-care. It's a fallacy. It's insane. And taken to the extreme, if your daughter was being abused by somebody, you would never tell her, well, stick it out. Forgive him, forget him, and don't abandon him. Of course not. Everybody listening to this would suggest to somebody being abused at that level to take care of themselves first. So it's really battling your guilt that's coming for self-care. When people ask me in therapy all the time, when they say, how do you cross that threshold and get to that place of transformation that you're often talking about? My answer usually is you have to be willing to feel guilt. A great book for this is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. There's a quote in my book, The Audacity to Be You, that you read that says, a healthy boundary. I love this quote. It's not mine. It's somebody else's that I borrowed. A healthy boundary is the distance between me and you at which I can love me and you. There's no rule or commandment that I would ask you to live up to that says you have to maintain a certain level of proximity and relationships to people that have hurt you. And here's the magic. If somebody in my life, just using this as a thought experiment, as an example, if somebody in my life, children and spouse included, said to me, being in close relationship with you is toxic or damaging for me, I would support them 100 times out of 100 at taking the distance that they need. I read somewhere in the last couple of days somebody talking about being in a relationship with a narcissist. And at one point in the breakup, the narcissistic person said to the person breaking up, saying, "You're not done with me." Healthy people allow other people to set boundaries in their life because they're not so desperately compromised that they can't tolerate it. So we learn in this work to give people boundaries. We learn in this work not to take them on as personal affronts or injuries. And here's the magic. When you do that, if you're the kind of person that lets somebody take boundaries from you when they need to, why would they go anywhere forever anyway? I want to be in relationship with people in my life that if I need to step away to take care of myself, they're okay with it. A lot of parents with young adult children will ask me, but my young adult child is estranged or has pulled away or doesn't want to talk. What I coach and teach all the time is let them. Signal that you're ready to talk if they want to go to therapy, if they need to say difficult things, but let them. But to require to hold them obligated to being in a relationship with you, that's an invasion of a boundary. That's abuse. And that's coming from the narcissistically wounded person who's not allowing for the boundary. So my doctor's note for you, if you will, is you get to do what you need to do to take care of you. And if the other person is earns the relationship with you by allowing and respecting that, they don't have to agree with you. They don't have to like it. They don't have to be on the same page with you. But if they allow it, that allowance is itself evidence of health, of mental health. So in toxic families, in children that grow up in alcoholic families, loyalty is overemphasized, right? You have to be loyal to the system, to the family, to the religion, even if it's abusive. So healthy people allow for complexities and self-care. Someone says, thoughts about finding a family therapist that is a good fit for a parent and a child when a child is in treatment out of a state and can't participate in interviewing therapists. I have experience with finding individual therapists, but not family therapy. I might choose a family therapist who is a good fit for me, but not my child. What is the best way to involve them in that process? Only parent with only child. That makes it a little bit easier. Only parent with only child. I think you both kind of get. I think you both kind of get a trump card, right? It has to work for both of you, and it might take a little while. Therapy is a serious business. Somebody wrote the other day, I read, somebody said, we miss part of the equation when we tell people that going to therapy can be helpful. Really, going to good therapy can be helpful. And so I would take your knowledge. I would take your questions. I hope, gosh, I really hope that your experience at Evoke with these podcasts, with the books that I've written, I would hope that gives you some sense of what an adequate therapist is like. What are their features? I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist, and so It's within my training that the kind of principles that we talk about are there. So you get to decide and they get to decide. Maybe have them decide first, the child that is. Decide if they like the family therapist first. But I've had a handful of family therapists for my family over the years, and many of them, we have one right now that's primarily a therapist for one of my children, but we do family therapy with him. It's fantastic, wonderful. Meets us all where we're at. And I've had others that are pretty limited. I've written about this on my personal blog about what to look for in a therapist. It's one of the chapters in my book, The Audacity to Be You. I wrote a journal article about it. If you go to any of my social media and click on my link tree, the journal article that my wife and I wrote about psychology and therapy, I mean, you're allowed to be an informed consumer, but maybe let your child pick first, and then you come next. You still can opt out. There are therapists that my child might like that I might say, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to meet with this person. And it might take a few. And most people are doing virtual therapy these days. That's really important to remember. You know, many people are only doing virtual therapy these days. And so you don't have to have one in your city. Word of mouth is really good, and you don't have to have one in your city. They can be across the country, across the Atlantic Ocean in some cases. So those are some thoughts. I hope it's helpful. Someone wrote, last session you presented the idea that marriage is not about making the other happy, but about transformation. That any fool can fall in love, but truly loving is something much deeper. Curious where this leaves all the passion, romantic, newly in love feelings of love. Do you think these are not sustainable or realistic over a long-term partnership or marriage? I think those will ebb and flow. And I think in my marriage, there are definitely times when we recapture those. And that comes from the vulnerability of showing up, honest and taking risks. It comes as we transform and grow. My marriage, what my wife and I call marriage 2.0, it's not by any means perfect, but it's much better than it was when it was that shallower version that was based on the passions. So yes, I think it can come and go. But for me, I had to mature enough to realize that I had to make it through and be willing to do the work, and my wife too, to make it through the difficult times, to work on that transformation, so that we could find those moments. I love those moments. They're wonderful moments in our marriage for sure, but it's not all that. And if we have a kind of, I would say, immature idea about marriage, when that dies off, the work begins. And unless you want to keep finding new partners over and over again, because it will happen over and over again, if you just want to be a serial monogamist, right? Just trade it in for a new partner. Once that dies down, go to a new partner. It'll happen over and over and over again. You'll feel that thrill of newness, of novelty over and over again, but you won't make it to the next level. I talk about playing a video game, imagine a video game where it kind of has levels of difficulty. And at some point, it's not fun to just turn the game off and start over again at level 1, because level 1 is boring and easy. At some point, you're going to have to decide if you want to try and work through level 7. And for us in our marriage, it has been incredibly painful and terrifying and difficult and rocky at times. And we have, to my credit, I've worked through it. And to my wife's beautiful credit, she's worked through it. And it's something different and bigger now. So someone writes, is the Evoke Young Adult program substantively different from the adolescent one? Not really. In fact, it's remarkably the same. We, of course, take into account that there's choice. They have a little bit more investment in the next step and the length of stay, but day to day, overall process, it's virtually the same. Someone writes, my son has been at Evoke Cascades for 1 week now. My wife and I each wrote a hopes and intentions letter and emailed them. When will those be read? How often should I be writing my son, and should those be sent regular letters or email to Evoke? They should be sent by email. It takes a little bit too long. I answered this question a little bit earlier. Somebody asked the same one, so if you were a little bit late to the start, that was one of the first questions tonight. They get letters once a week, so that will usually be read at the therapist's first visit after they've looked at the hopes and intentions letter. There's no rush in the beginning. There's no rush. The program intentionally starts slow and deliberate, right? And so you've done what you've done. Wait to talk to your therapist. Go back and listen to this podcast tomorrow where I spend a few minutes talking about this. There are podcasts and YouTube videos that they're the same content. It's the same recording, just one has the video to it, where I talk about letter writing. So just go to our Finding You, subscribe to Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast on any of your podcast apps, and then search within the channel, search for letter writing, and I'll talk about it for that full hour. And then make sure you're going through your portal and following the podcasts or the webinars where I talk about each thing at each stage of the program. Someone says our 16-year-old son is just about to complete his first 10 days at Evoke. We got a lot of new folks today. His first 10 days at Evoke, but his biological mother, from where a lot of the trauma arises, is not in communication with us or willing to participate in his healing journey. How might this affect his therapy? I imagine it will be a focus. Therapy is, the old adage of give a person a fish, feed him for a day, teach them how to fish, feed them for a lifetime. If we borrow on that analogy in therapy, we're really teaching people how to feel. Now, we therapists are good fishermen and fisherwomen, right? We know where the fish are. We know the bait. And so we go looking in those places, like an estranged biological mother, right? An alcoholic parent, being put up for adoption, being a transracially adopted child, having a learning disability, being bullied. All of those things, those are the places that we look. Those are the usual suspects, if you will. So we look there. We look, kind of turn the rock over and see what's underneath. But ultimately, we're trying to teach them how to feel, because I haven't said this in a long time, but it's true. Unfortunately, the worst things in life haven't happened to most of these children. I suppose for some it may have, but for a lot of people, and you all know that because you're older, that what you thought was the worst thing in life when you were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 is now not the worst thing. And so really therapy is about teaching people how to feel. So we'll ask about that. That's one of the usual suspects. We'll see if that applies. I have to take a sip of water. Somebody writes, my daughter is still sending angry letters home after 5 weeks at Evoke. She indicates that I need to get it together. I take it as a veiled threat. So with regard to what you said about relationships, is it acceptable to let the child, once 18, who says bug off, just let them go? I guess that remark assumes she'd be financially responsible for herself too. I'm just tired of the manipulation. It's a great question. Your job between now and then is to get as clear as possible so you know what your issues are. Right? That's your project. When people become fixated on the same message over and over again, the anger, and this is true even if it's just the one time. I want to be clear. You're allowed to say to anybody, anytime, I can't hear that. Now, we try to develop enough emotional resources, enough awareness, enough capacity to be able to hold space for those that we love, especially our children. But hear this clearly. You can only tolerate what you can tolerate. Let me respond to your question in kind of an example way. When she says you need to get it together, my response is, you have no idea. I'm working on it. Oh my gosh, is this a wake-up call for me? I definitely have to get it together. Right? If you can take that approach, you're not triggered or manipulated by it. You know, when you say a great book is The Dance of Anger. The Dance of Anger teaches us it's a book about boundaries, actually. It's not about anger. I want to be clear about that. She talks about anger, but it's really a book about boundaries. And what happens is we often substitute anger for boundaries. So what we learn about this is that manipulation is a thing you do together. You know, I said to somebody today that when young adults and adolescents come to our program at first, they'll say things to me when I'm doing the early sessions with them. They'll say things to me like, you don't care, or you're not being fair, or whatever they accuse me of. What I learn in that moment is oh, that works for you at home. Your parent needs to be fair or seen as fair, or that they cared. And so when you accuse somebody of not caring, you expect them to capitulate. Right? That's what I'm going through in my brain. I learn about the parents' vulnerabilities. I learn about the parents' shadow or insecurities by what the child accuses me of. Because that tells me that's what's worked for you. So when you say your child is manipulative, not you specifically, but you in general, when you tell me your child is manipulative, my thought is they're probably resourceful and bright and smart, but the manipulation is specific to you. It might not work with me. And also what might work with me might not work with you. So your child is asking you to do your work, to shore yourself up, to fill the holes that are in you, that are in all of us, so that when they poke there, it doesn't index you, right? It doesn't take hold of you. So between now and then, your project is to do your work. And then when they accuse you of being the monster, you know, I joke about this, and I say when your children accuse you of being an idiot, you can just agree with them. I talk about that in the first book. And I try to say, you have no idea. You've only scratched the surface of my idiocy. That's the tip of the iceberg of my idiocy. You should talk to my therapist. She'd really give you an earful of what an idiot I can become, or I have been in my life. So you learn to fix yourself so they don't have to. You learn to fill holes in you so they're not responsible, so they don't have access, so they can't in the short term use them against you. But ultimately you get to set a boundary. And yes, if ultimately they are abusive and angry and repetitively complaining, you can say, you can go somewhere else, or we can do our work individually and separate if you want to work on this. You can give them options, right? I'm willing to do X, Y, or Z with these conditions. And between now and then, you'll learn what those non-negotiable conditions are. That's not conditional love. That's conditional self-care. Like, I can't be hit in the nose over and over again. I have time for one more question. Someone says, how do you help your child who found their best friend dead on an overdose? He won't talk to me about it, and I know he feels so much guilt and pressure to the child's parents to be perfect and live the life the child would have lived, plus trying to live a better life for us, his parents, for all the time and money we spent on him getting him help. He knows how much wilderness costs and boarding school. We have not talked about the cost, only how proud we are of how much work he has done to get where he is now. This is a powerful question to end on. Remember this, folks. Some of you may have heard me say this. For some of you, especially all those that are new, this might be new for you. It's not your child's job to make you proud. That's a great burden for them. My mother tells me all the time that she's proud of me, and it doesn't matter to me. None of this has been for her. And as we grow up, we have to let go of what our parents think about us. And so for many of our children's mental health, the burdens that your child is carrying, the guilt that he is carrying, he is feeling responsible for what everybody thinks and feels, and to be free. There's a quote that a Buddhist monk told to me one time that said, in order to grow up, we have to kill our parents. Of course, meaning we have to let go of what they think of us. If you go to Al-Anon, they teach you what you think about me is none of my business. What you think about me is none of my business. And that applies to the parent and the child. And so your son is living a life where he thinks what other people think and feel about him is his to carry. So you learn to be whole. You learn to be separate. You learn to detach. But really, when I say detach, you're learning to find a healthy attachment, not an anxious attachment. You learn not to hand your fears and your worries. I said to a therapist one time when he was praising a young adult doing work in the program the first couple of weeks, and the therapist was effusive about the work. I said to the therapist when we were doing supervision later, I said, be careful. You're lathering on so much praise. Be careful. Because along with being proud of your child, then you can be disappointed in them. My clients tell me that when they first hear me say what I'm about to say, they think I'm crazy. But I aspire to never be proud or disappointed in my children. What I want to do is love them and support them as much as I'm able to get where they need to go, and I don't know where that is. So healthy love is something different than most of us were taught. Healthy love is mixed up with fear and anxiety and control. Healthy love is the way what we were taught about healthy love is often codependency. So learn about codependency. Listen to some of the podcasts about healthy detachment and learn that your child is really carrying the world on his shoulders. And inadvertently, through no malfeasance on your own, you've been a part of that, as have I with my children. Because we tell them how we feel, and we do it as if to indicate to them the rightness or the wrongness of what they are doing. And we think we're doing them good, and we're not. We're just teaching them that what other people think about them is about them, and it's not. Let me go over some updates, and then I'll close. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, we have intensives online and in person. We postponed the one for January because the COVID spike is just too threatening. We still do testing and quarantining, but we're going to push them back and make sure that the spike has subsided some. So you can do them online in the meantime. January 13th for the online one, February 24th as it stands right now, February 24th for the in-person one. Finding you two in April. Go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. If you want to do a deep dive and really get into your own work, that's the best jumping off point in my opinion. It's what I do every year for myself. We have a new spring break trip, a Southern Utah multi-sport trip for young adults 18 and older, March 12th through 14th. So we'll be putting that together for you. So reach out to Sarah without an H at evoketherapy.com, Sarah without an H at evoketherapy.com. You can also use the pursuits trips, the adventure trips, 3 to 30 days for families or for young adults that are customized, maybe even in-between programs. Support groups for parents that are current or former parents. The next one will be December 17th. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We also have alumni support groups for our intensives program. That'll be January 12th at 6 p.m. Email Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. We ask all, please. These are free. You don't get a lot of free stuff in mental health. But we ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups while their child is with us. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adultchildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org for free resources, classes, education in your local area. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. You can go just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy podcast, or you can go to soundcloud.com on your computer or YouTube. We have all of these on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram. At Evoke Therapy is the handle, or on Instagram at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find Evoke Therapy Intensives or Evoke Therapy programs there. Also, go to our blog. My daughter, the wonderful Emma Reedy, just wrote a blog this week on external validation. So check it out there. The Journey of the Heroic Parent is available on Amazon, as is my new book, The Audacity to Be You, which is also now available in audio, narrated by me. So you can get that on Audible or through your Apple audio bookstore, or you can go to Amazon.com. All right, folks. I'm going to be taking next week off. I think I'm going to get a special guest speaker for next week. But for now, I won't be back until the 28th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, where I'll be continuing my series with Chapter 6, Knowing Mental Health, from my new book. I'm going through a series of those. So I look forward to that. Thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you for and on behalf of those that you love and that love you for being willing to do your own work, to take the heroic journey and look at yourself. That is the heroic journey. It's self-exploration. Take care, folks. Have a great holiday and a great week and a half, 2 weeks, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.